My name is Carla Cucci, and I'm the current president of MITA. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for the kickoff of our 2023-2024 programming year with our webinar, Preparing for a Successful Customs Audit. I'd like to start off by asking everyone, except for the three speakers, to please turn off your camera and mute your microphone so that we do not have any problems with our bandwidth. Not that we don't want to see you all, we definitely do, but want to make sure that we can keep streaming this consistently and so it's an enjoyable presentation for everyone. If you have, there will be opportunities to ask questions at the end of the three presentations. You can also send your questions via the chat feature located on the right-hand side of the WebEx screen. I would also like to note that today's session is being recorded. A video copy as well as copies of two of the presentations will be available for free to all current MITA members. And in case you do not want your name or your picture to appear on the video recording, please use the chat box to ask your questions at the end. For those who are not MITA members, first of all, welcome. Thank you for attending. We're happy to have you here. And I'd like to give you a little bit of background about MITA. Since 1979, the Madison International Trade Association has brought together representatives like you from companies around Wisconsin who are interested in increasing their knowledge of the international trade issues. MITA is an organization whose mission is to foster understanding of these issues, practices, information, legislation, and trends that affect and influence all aspects of international trade. Our sessions are educational in nature, but also offer great networking opportunities to the attendees. MITA exists because of its strong membership, an all-volunteer board of directors, and our amazing communication and events coordinator, Anna Garich. Thank you so much, Anna. She is on the call today, as many of our board members are as well. With that, if you are not already a member of MITA, I encourage you to join and promote membership to your colleagues as well. You can sign up online at www.mitatrade.org. And as I mentioned before, one of the primary advantages of being a MITA member is networking. When you join MITA, you will find that you will deepen existing business relationships and make new contacts on a regular basis, especially with our in-person luncheons. And we have one coming up in October. I'll share with you in just a moment. MITA provides a platform for you to form lasting ties with other professionals involved in international business. As with any organization, the strength of MITA is dependent upon its membership, strong participation from its members, and sponsorships. Today's program is brought to you through the generous support of our annual sponsors and diligent organization from the MITA Board of Directors. I'd like to thank our annual sponsors. At the platinum level, we have Day and Company, Star 7, FTI Consulting, and WEDC. At the gold level, we have LR International, the Division of International Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, DEC or DEC Wisconsin, and the U.S. Commercial Service Export Compliance. And at the silver level, we have International Customs Services. MITA encourages service providers and other organizations to become a sponsor of MITA or sponsor a MITA event. This is a good way to spread the word about your services to MITA's growing membership base. If you want more details about sponsorship, please contact Poonam Arora, one of our board members and MITA sponsorship director, after the session. As for upcoming events, as I mentioned, next month we will feature an in-person event, Mastering the Current Global Supply Chain Landscape. This will be on Tuesday, October 10th at the Fluno Center in Madison. MITA is proud to bring you Matt Dollard, Management Consulting Principal at RSM, and Matt will share the issues and challenges in global supply chain that his clients are still facing internationally in 2023. Again, this is an in-person event hosted at the Fluno Center, which will begin with networking at 11:30, lunch at noon, and the presentation will begin no later than 12:30. For more details and to register, also visit our website, mitatrade.org. All right, on to today's presentation. I would like to first recognize the champion for today's event, Allison Jacobs. She has spearheaded and organized the session today, as well as the programming committee and other board members who helped with logistics for this event. I will now turn the podium over to Allison, who is also representing FTI Consulting, to introduce herself and the other speakers.
Great. Thank you, Carla.
You're welcome.
Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. Let me know if you can all see.
Yep, we can see it. Looks good to me.
Okay, great. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So thank you all for joining us today. As Carla mentioned, my name is Allison Jacobs. I'm a director at FTI Consulting. My colleagues Matt Williams and Courtney Stiers are joining me today to discuss customs audits. Now, I know customs audits are probably not the most exciting topic, but it is important for all of the importers, service providers, and customs brokers to be aware of CBP audits, what they might mean, and how to approach them to mitigate risk. Throughout our presentation, we will also try to keep you all engaged and awake with some opportunities to participate. Before we jump in, I just have a quick disclaimer from our firm. The information and materials presented in today's slides and training sessions are for educational and training purposes only. This content is not intended to be a substitute for legal, regulatory, or policy guidance, nor should it be construed as such. Okay, now that we have that out of the way, to start off, and again, in the spirit of keeping everyone engaged, we wanted to take a quick minute to get to know you all. So first of all, don't worry, this is not going to be an awkward icebreaker where everyone shares their name and where they're from and their favorite flavors of ice cream. We just want to kind of understand who all is joining us today. So does everyone see a hand icon at kind of the bottom right of their screen? If so, can you go ahead and tap that icon so I know you all can see it? Great. I see a few people. If not, you have a minute or so to find that. Okay, so how many of you folks are importers? If you are, push that hand icon. Okay, great. See, we have a lot of importers joining us. Okay, how many are customs brokers? Go ahead and push that hand icon. Okay, have a few brokers. And then finally, how many of you are service providers? So working or supporting the trade industry in a similar way. All right, good. So it looks like we have a pretty good representation of the trade industry here. We all may engage with customs in different ways or at different points, but I think we can all appreciate the importance of compliance and understanding customs' role and their mission and how that ties into how they approach audits and assessments. So my next question, since we have a pretty wide variety of participants, is how comfortable are you with customs audits? Are you pretty new to this topic and maybe looking to get more familiar with it? If so, click the hand icon. Okay, I see some hands going up. For those of you who are pretty new to this, we're happy that you're taking an interest, and we hope to give you some kind of foundational knowledge on the CBP audit program. Now, raise your hand if you are pretty comfortable with this topic. Maybe you participated in an audit before, or you're just looking to expand your knowledge. Okay, I see it.
Yeah, your class.
Okay.
And this on the DK wipes should be in the OTC fold area here.
Okay. Okay, So we're happy you've all joined us and to continue learning, and we hope we can share some additional information and tips to build on what you might already know. Okay, so here we have our agenda for today. These topics really show our goal of everyone coming away from this webinar with an understanding of the different types of audits and assessments, some tips on how to engage with customs, and best practices to make sure you can prepare your own compliance programs now and stay comfortably prepared for the possibility of an audit or assessment in the future. So we're going to start with looking at some recent trends we have seen from customs over the past few years and what they might signal going forward. So customs has been pretty enforcement focused over the past few years, with an increase in trade-related investigations and a focus on securing and recovering revenue. This is pretty clear in a few cases that I've highlighted here. I'm not going to go into all of the facts of each one, but basically these boil down to classification errors, valuation errors, and origin errors. Customs strongly investigated these errors and then litigated to try to secure a favorable outcome for CBP. We should also all note that many of the highest risk areas to trigger audits and investigations are linked to ongoing tension between the US and China. I know we are all pretty familiar with that in the trade industry, and we can see that risks are higher for example, misclassification that could lead to incorrectly applying Section 301 punitive tariffs, origin determinations that, again, may signal avoidance of those tariffs, and then more recently, forced labor requirements that involve imports from China. So to effectively mitigate these risks, CBP is really looking for strong internal controls. For importers, these are a way to signal to CBP that you're really fulfilling your duty of reasonable care. So we strongly stress the importance of having those internal controls now instead of risking being caught without them. Now, if we compare the audit activity between 2022 and so far in 2023, it does look like the number of audits has gone down. However, note the dramatic increase in forced labor investigations and detentions. In Q1 and Q2 of this year, CBP had already detained more shipments for forced labor review than in the roughly 6 months that the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, or UFLPA, was in effect in 2022. Obviously, this highlights CBP's intense focus on this particular issue. Okay, so in addition to obviously the forced labor investigations, we're going to look at some of the different types of customs inquiries. So here we have two main types of customs inquiries that we're going to be covering today. There are audits and assessments. Audits are more in-depth reviews with a scope determined by a risk assessment and data analysis by customs. These can cover one specific topic. They can cover a broad range of topics depending on the risk that customs believe the importer poses to compliance. It's important to note that the launch of a customs audit does not always indicate that customs has uncovered a compliance issue. That may be the case in some scenarios, but it is not always the case. It could mean that your trade flows or your activity just pose a higher risk to customs, and you should have the strong internal controls to address those risks, and that is what customs is looking to verify via an audit. Next, we have assessments. Assessments are actually referred to as non-audit services by customs. Now, whether or not we all agree that a customs assessment is really a service to us all is probably up for debate, but these are generally less intrusive than an audit, less intensive, and usually more efficient, so shorter timelines. Even though the assessments may seem less intrusive, they should still be taken seriously. This is because a negative assessment can actually trigger a more in-depth audit. So importers, if being faced with a customs assessment, they should really treat this the same way they would treat an audit. Make sure, internal controls are there. Communications with customs are very carefully crafted, and making sure that you're conveying what you need to convey to customs to prevent a further audit. Okay. So let's look at a few types of customs audits. So here we have the focused assessment program and then referral audits. So focused assessments, I know that's kind of a misnomer since it's actually a type of audit, not an assessment, these are going to be one of the most in-depth types of audits. These don't really have a focused topic usually. They're more of a comprehensive analysis of an importer's risk overall. These usually also have the longest timelines of any audit. You'll see here on the short end, these can be around 9 months, while on the high end, they can be about 2 years. We actually have a colleague at our firm who worked on one of these in the past, and his lasted over 5 years. So that's definitely an outlier, but he claims to hold the record for longest focused assessment. So if anybody has a longer one, I'd love to hear it. Next, we have referral audits. Referral audits are going to have a very specific objective and a more limited scope. So these are generally triggered by a referral to investigate a risk. So for example, if an importer shows a lack of internal controls during a risk assessment, this may trigger a referral for a further audit. These generally have a timeline of about 9 months to 15 months. Okay. Next, we'll look at a few types of assessments. So first we have the Risk Analysis and Survey Assessment, or RASA. This is one of the newer types of assessments from CBP, where they focus on specific areas or potential risks. The authority of this assessment actually comes from 19 USC 1509A, which covers CBP's right to examine an importer's books or witnesses. So basically, Customs has the right to look at your trade data, Customs forms, to assess your overall risk for them. These usually will last between 3 to 6 months. And then finally, we have a risk assessment that's completed via a CBP Form 28 or 29. These forms are basically used to collect importer information so CBP can determine their level of risk of noncompliance. It's important if you receive one of these to carefully prepare all responses. And we recommend reviewing with outside counsel or trade consultants because these are official communications with Customs. Even though they might look a little more informal because they look kind of like a questionnaire, anything that you document in one of these forms is going to Customs and it could trigger a further audit, again, if Customs finds that you have weak internal controls. And we'll go a little more into the CF Form 28 and 29 in a little bit. So finally, we have a few other types of inquiries to mention. These generally go along with the audits or assessments that we've already covered, but we wanted to make sure to call them out. So as I previously mentioned, Customs regularly uses questionnaire type forms to gather information from importers. These can be that CF Form 28 or 29 that I mentioned, or they can be perhaps industry-specific questionnaires. So maybe every importer in the auto industry receives the same questionnaire. This allows Customs to analyze and review the risk of that industry as a whole. And again, more recently, these types of questionnaires are being used to identify risks of forced labor. So there is a specific forced labor questionnaire that is going to certain importers. And finally, we have import specialist visits. These can range quite a bit. They can be a virtual meeting with one import specialist. They can be a facility tour with multiple specialists. It's important to note, though, that these will generally be arranged ahead of time, with importers being contacted with a request for a visit. These should be treated differently or not to be confused with a foreign trade zone CBP visit. Those can be unannounced. What we're talking about here is likely not going to be unannounced. Okay, next we're going to cover penalties. So these are really the quantifiable risks of not complying with CBP regulations. Penalties will fall into generally two categories: civil penalties and criminal penalties. Civil penalties are the primary enforcement tool for customs, and they do use them. These are regularly assessed. They can apply regardless of duty impact. So even if your classification error is between two duty-free subheadings, CBP can assess penalty. That's because CBP sees classification as really an absolute exercise. You're either right or you're wrong. With that said, Customs does consider some factors when making their penalty assessment. So Customs might consider, was this an actual entry versus an attempted entry? Was the error a result of a false statement, omission, or act? The materiality of the error. And then finally, the level of culpability of the importer. So all of these taken together will allow Customs to determine the level of a penalty or whether a penalty is assessed at all. So as I mentioned, Customs considers three levels of culpability for importers. These are going to be fraud, gross negligence, and negligence. Fraud is defined as voluntarily or intentionally committing an act of noncompliance. Gross negligence is actual knowledge or a wanton disregard for customs regulations. And then finally, negligence is a failure to exercise reasonable care. So defining your level of culpability may include analyzing and communicating mitigating factors around an error that is uncovered. For example, perhaps you have an error on one transaction out of thousands of transactions, but as a single importer. This would probably indicate that the error is singular in nature and it's not a sign of, systemic problems. You would still probably be at a lower risk. Also, if, let's say, an importer identifies an error, quickly remediates it with a voluntary disclosure, again, we'll discuss those later, and then adjust their internal controls to prevent it in the future. Those are all valid mitigating factors that Customs may consider because it shows that the importer has already addressed the error. They've already communicated with Customs, and they're also trying to prevent additional errors going forward. This also shows a level of cooperation with Customs, which is another mitigating factor to keep in mind. And then finally, we have criminal penalties. These are a little less likely, I hope, for everyone on the call today, but these will be assessed based on the specific violation of these regulations that I have listed here. So these include making false statements to Customs, smuggling goods, and then making entries based on false statements. So the penalties for those are listed here. Again, hopefully that information does not need to be used by you all. Okay, so now that we've covered the different types of audits and assessments and kind of laid the foundation for understanding the risks of each type of review, we're going to shift to how to prepare for them and what to expect. So I'll turn it over to Courtney for that discussion.
Thank you, Allison. Okay, so we are going to walk through the next few slides about what you can expect from a CBP during an audit or an assessment and kind of what that looks like. Next slide. So first, we want to talk about who is looking at your import data. There's a common misconception that only CBP is privy to your import data, and they would only be the ones to initiate an audit or request for information. That is just simply not true. Anyone who takes part in FDA or other partner government agencies know that they all have access to that information as well. On this slide, you'll see that we have some common entities that could potentially review your import data. It's also important to note that you usually have to be subject to some type of regulations or licensing in order to have some of these additional entities review that data. So you're not gonna, if you're not importing FDA regulated goods, you're not gonna have the FDA teams looking at it. But we wanted to call out some of the more common ones. So you're gonna have import specialists, the Trade Regulatory Audit Group, the National Targeting and Analysis Group, INTAG, Centers of Excellence and Expertise. Those are usually assigned based on your different commodities that you're importing. You have the Commercial Enforcement Analysis and Response Teams, Enforcement Analysis, and then you also have Homeland Security Investigations. So collectively, all of these people could potentially be looking at your import data and working with CBP to decide if the information might be incorrect or if they need additional information to understand the admissibility of your goods. Additionally, this is not an all-inclusive list. This is just a summary of some of the potential ones. Next slide, please. So one of the reasons we listed in the previous slide all of those entities is that it's important to understand your different due diligence requirements and what you need to be reporting to remain compliant with each of those entities, CBP included. So here we have the 4 elements of due diligence. The first element is compliance. Compliance means importers must follow all relevant laws, US laws and regulations. I have mentioned in the previous slide, as well as you're going to hear it again in future slides, that compliance is essential in preventing, mitigating, and kind of helping reduce the number of audits or the potential for an audit. If your imports or your commodity require additional oversight by other regulators or licensing entities, you may also have additional due diligence in their reporting requirements. To have a successful compliance as part of your due diligence, you need to have strong internal controls and procedures within your compliance practices. This means that your compliance controls should be part of your supply chain, but also part of your procurement review when sourcing new commodities and manufacturers. Additionally, compliance means maintaining good communication with CBP, which is a reoccurring theme that you should be noticing in this presentation. The second core element of due diligence is social responsibility. So social responsibility requires importer to have clear and transparent social audit program meeting the reasonable care obligations. If you or your company do not understand or know what the reasonable care obligations are, CBP does have an entire dedicated web page that lists the different commodities, the different types of reasonable care that we can share with you after this presentation. To be successful in social responsibility, importers should be committing to CBP's goals of promoting national security. Importers should also be ensuring that their imports meet fundamental labor rights, especially within child enforcement labor laws and forced labor. I'm sure everyone by now is aware that forced labor is a hot topic within the compliance community. There is a heightened awareness, like I mentioned, of forced labor within the US supply chain or the goods going into the US. CBP is making sure that importers are doing their due diligence and ensuring that they are sourcing from lawful manufacturers. That brings me into my third point of the core elements. The third core element of due diligence is traceability. Importers should be able to trace back the source of their imported goods from the origin. This means that importers should be enforcing record keeping and documenting policies that meet the statutory requirements and are regularly reviewed, struggle with that word all the time, while documenting and assessing their suppliers' manufacturing. With the recent changes on forced labor, traceability is more essential than ever in the supply chain. With forced labor also being a bigger issue than ever, more companies are realizing that their traceability within their supply chain and their overall transparency within their supply chain is severely lacking. CBP has presumed assumption, which means that you have to prove your goods are not made with forced labor through your documentation. A lot of suppliers do not have the documentation to be able to prove that fact, even though their goods may not be made with forced labor. They just don't have the traceability that's required by CBP for the forced labor requirements. The fourth element is remediation. When a company is found to have breached compliance or there's a risk involved, the importer has a right to create a corrective action plan and address the risk and the violation prior to CBP issuing a CF-29 or CF-28. Being able to identify a violation prior to CBP identifying that violation is a great mitigating factor, which Allison mentioned earlier, if you are ever involved in an audit. To be successful in remediation, companies should be documenting an escalation plan and identifying errors throughout the process. A successful corrective action plan should be reviewed a few months post-implementation to ensure that no further violations were made and that the controls and processes put in place are actually preventing future violations. As mentioned before, with presumed assumption, the forced labor issues that CBP is focusing on, a lot of companies are reaching out to consultants or third-party auditors to review their supply chain and their documentation to make sure that they are doing everything they can to prevent issues with CBP. Additionally, they're also reaching out to consultants and third-party auditors to see what efficiencies or what opportunities for improvement within their supply chain, their documentation, their traceability is available within their supply chain. Next slide, please. All right, we are moving on to CF-28s and CF-29s. You're going to hear me say CF-28, 29 quite frequently over the next few minutes. So to clear that up, the CF-28 or Customs Form 28 is a request for information. A CF-29, Customs Form 29, is a notice of action. CBP often sends a CF-28 or a CF-29 when additional information is required or CBP is under the belief that the importer has incorrectly or illegally imported merchandise into the United States. In most cases, and I say most cases with the heavy disclaimer, is that the CF-28 usually comes prior to the CF-29. However, that is not the case in every situation. For a CF-28, CBP will initially send the importer the CF-28 form to collect additional information and facts on the situation that they have identified. Typical reasons for a CF-28 to be issued include tariff classifications, valuations, FTA or other program eligibility issues, but most commonly recently is country of origin issues and AD/CVD issues. If you receive a CF-28, you have 30 days, you and your company have 30 days to respond to it and provide CBP with all the information and the facts from the date that the CF-28 was issued. Customs Form 29, which is a notice of action, is typically a form CBP sends out when they are proposing to action or they have decided to take action on a single transaction, entry, or group of entries. Common actions from a C20 that companies receive from a CF-29 include paying additional duties because an item was classified incorrectly, tariff assessments for duties that are found to be subject to AD/CVD, denial of an FTA or other preferential programs, changing a country of origin, which can also cause additional duties, or AD/CVD, depending on where the country of origin was. And then rate advance due to undeclared additions on entries. So if you've left things off your entry, requiring additional duties to be added. A CF-29 is a little bit different than a 28 and that you have 20 days to make a response. If you or the company does not respond within those 20 days, CBP will assume the import was out of compliance and will commence the liquidation process. There are some caveats I like to mention with these two forms. One, before you respond, I always recommend taking a break, understanding what CBP is asking, but then also looking at the impacted entries and your imports and the information involved. If there are other entities involved or other PGAs, you're going to want to make sure that the information you provide and all your facts are in line with every entity involved in the import or the situation at hand before you provide that response to CBP. The response to CBP should be carefully crafted in that you're providing the answers that are requested by CBP, but not providing too much information that you put yourself at risk of them finding, excuse me, of them finding additional information or something else that you may not have disclosed in the beginning. If you're issued a CF-28, more often than not, you're allowed to file a prior disclosure on anything that you may find while you're reviewing or responding to that information to customs. However, if you have a CF-29, more often than not, you're not eligible for a prior disclosure on the transaction entry or groups of entries that are involved in that CF-29. Previously, CF-28s and CF-29s were sent in the mail to the importer to the headquarters address listed for the IOR number, the importer of record number. That has recently changed, and CBP is now sending all CF-28 and 29 forms through ACE. So it's very vital that companies know who their ACE account manager is and are reviewing that continuously and making sure you have access. If you don't have an ACE account, know that the password expires quite frequently. So continuously or having a calendar reminder to log in and make sure you don't lose access is very important. Next slide, please, Allison. A little bit repetitive to what I have already said, but I think it's important to continuously repeat, is that when you're responding to any CBP inquiry, a good general guideline to responding is to review all the agencies involved and understand why you're being asked this question. Review your entry, review your data, review your packing list, review your country of origin, see if you can trace everything back to better understand why CBP is reaching out to you about the situation. Then you want to evaluate all the facts of the situation. This includes looking for any recent rulings, regulations, finding rulings for classification, anything that might help justify the reason that you did what you did. This may include putting together a reasonable care memo, putting together a prior disclosure. The CF-28 and CF-29 are definitely forms in a response that a company with a good compliance team could answer to. However, it's always recommended, and I've even heard CBP recommend this in a recent conference, that you reach out to a consultant or your internal counsel prior to sending your response in. Those responses are binding's not the right word, but CBP can use your response against you. So whatever you do say can be held against you, essentially. It's also important to note that you must respond to the CF-28 and 29. A timely response is very important. Not responding would assume that your company is guilty. However, you want to take your time in crafting your response and collecting your facts, so you don't want to rush to respond. And then I wanted to mention again about the ACE. If you do have an ACE account and you utilize a broker, you can actually set up your broker to receive CF-28s and 29s. A courtesy copy is what CBP says. So if you are issued one, you have a secondary backup to be able to notify that you are impacted by a CF-28 or 29. So before we move on, I just wanted to give you a quick example. It's a question, so feel free to play along in the chat if you want. A company receives a CF-28 in the mail or via ACE, indicating that the government is reviewing its entries for possible issues associated with the classification and anti-dumping cases. The company files a prior disclosure shortly after receiving this CF-28 in the mail. CBP says the company received a proper notice of an investigation in the CF-28 and denies the prior disclosure treatment. So my question is CBP correct in this? Does the CF-28, which is a request for information, qualify as a notice for formal investigation? gonna pause here for some answers. Give it another minute. All right.
I just want to say, I did warn everyone to pay attention at the beginning. There will be questions throughout, so I hope you're all participating.
Yep. Thanks, Doug. We appreciate it. All right. I'll go ahead and give you the answer. With most things in customs, the answer is probably not. The language in the process is reviewing for possible issues. So that was the language that was provided in the request for information. So reviewing for possible issues means CBP doesn't know for sure that there is an issue and they're trying to find additional information. Having a prior disclosure in this case would most likely still go through because the language in the request for information. Again, this is my soapbox, but I was a previous operator and in the compliance department prior to being a consultant, but this is why it's so important to have outside counsel or consultants read your CF-29s, because we look for language like that when crafting a response to CBP and trying to figure out the best mitigating factors moving forward. Next slide, please. All right, we included this slide in here just so everyone could have some familiarity with what the CF-28 looks like. With everything being digital nowadays, the form doesn't necessarily look like this when you get it or you receive it through ACE, but if you print it, it is going to look a little bit more like this. More often than not, your response to a CF-28 is going to be via a letter with attachments and supporting materials, but it will all be based on the information required or requested in this Form 28. Next slide, please, Allison. So what to expect from customs? We've broken this up into the 4 different categories along with the review phase. We have audit, audit survey, risk assessment, and import specialist visits. This gives you a little bit more of an overview of kind of the inclusiveness and what to expect and how to allocate your resources when an audit or an audit survey, risk assessment, or a specialist visit is coming. So detailed questionnaire request is going to be required by all of them. The initiation will be most likely an email or a formal letter from most of them. The risk assessment is an email, as well as the specialist visit. Again, all these notifications will still pop up through your ACE account as well. Walkthrough sample request. So everyone besides the importer specialist will receive this. However, they do have a right to request it when they are on site, although it's not likely that it'll be required. Formal entrance conference, only required in the audits. Additional sampling and site visits. Audits will for sure have additional samplings and site visits. You will often provide one document. They will find something in that document and continue going down rabbit holes until they find what they are looking for. As Allison mentioned, additional sampling and site visits, our previous colleague had 5 years worth of these. They go silent for a while, and then all of a sudden they're sitting at your warehouse for 2 weeks. So it's a very labor-intensive process. Audit surveys usually don't have extra sampling or site visits. That one is usually done via just paper review, and it's not as hands-on. Potentially lead to a full audit. Obviously, the audit's already an audit, but all 3 of the other assessments and audit can all lead to a full audit. However, the formal audit is the only one that will have an official report issued to the company in question. The audit survey may have one if there is corrective actions required by the client. Next slide, please. Right. Finally, I wanted to end with tips for working with CBP. These should all be very straightforward. in anyone who's involved in the compliance world, but definitely worth mentioning over and over again. So first tip is to ask for a clearly defined scope, an area of interest, and when. So this, if CBP is coming in for an audit, you want to know exactly what they're auditing and what their scope is. They should be working within that scope. If it's an audit, they have a little bit more freedom to reach outside of that. But if it's a audit survey, they should be remaining within that scope. If you have questions on the scope or you don't understand the scope fully, definitely ask questions about that. You want to have that all up front rather than trying to figure out halfway through after you've already given them information that they didn't necessarily need to receive. Pre-review the audit areas that CBP gives you. Again, make sure you understand everything that they're planning on asking in every department. If you need to bring in other resources, make sure you have them available and that they're aware of the stake and the requirements. You should be answering all of your questions respectfully and thoroughly, but not providing too much information. Remember, CBP always, anytime you're on CBP, it's answer the questions, but don't answer more than the questions. You definitely want to keep the chatting down to a minimum. And then make sure you understand your internal controls. If you have policies and procedures, make sure you're aware of that and following up with that. And also identify efforts made by your organization to remain compliant within laws and regulations. If you've made any corrective actions, make sure you have those listed, proof that you've reviewed them. And you also want to see if you do any types of audits, make sure you have all of that ready. Those can all contribute to different mitigating factors depending on what your scope is. And then finally, I've said it 400 times, don't offer up too much information. CBP can and will use anything you say or you provide them. So make sure you're only providing what was asked, but make sure you're providing what was asked. If you don't, then you could be susceptible to other charges. So with that, we're going to talk about how to better prepare for audits and assessment. I'm going to hand it over to Matt Williams.
Perfect. Thanks, Courtney. The best way to prepare is the old saying of you don't have to get ready if you stay ready, right? So how do we stay ready? Document and review, right? Whether it's documenting your own trade compliance processes, desk procedures, manuals. If you don't have one, write one. It doesn't have to be, down to follow the bouncing ball, nitty gritty. Anybody can do it, but documenting that reasonable care and your processes and how you are addressing some of the core pillars that customs looks into. Review any transfer related party pricing policies, customs rulings. It's not on here, but informed compliance publications, even some directives that customs puts out. They're great ways to kind of talk to the procedural aspects of what's customs looking for, how are they addressing some of these areas. Recent ACE data. This is not just the entry line summary ACE data, but who's your account owner? Who's listed as the person that's going to get 28s, 29s? Who's checking liquidation dates? There's more than just the entry. If you're not familiar with ACE, definitely explore the CBP ACE webpage and portal. There's a ton of really useful information. You'll just have to get an account and password and probably update your password and then try and log on and call somebody to update your password and get it. But eventually you'll get there, I promise. Any reports from recent internal or external audits, your import or bond, prior disclosure, post-summary correction log, which we'll talk about on the next slide. But essentially, anytime you've had a voluntary disclosure, document that, keep a log. Your power of attorney with your broker, if that's applicable, and engaging in outside counsel, trade compliance consultants. So a lot of times, audits, I think sometimes get the perspective of, oh, I don't have to do a whole lot until I get notified, right? But really, if you're having built in your process, whether it's quarterly, every 6 months, even, a minimum annually, having some review of these documents and your procedures is going to help you stay off the naughty list and not have to do some of the voluntary disclosures that we'll talk about on the next slide. So there's a couple ways you can make some corrections before the customs notifies you. Essentially, this is, you're playing ball in the house, you break the vase. Let's go tell mom before mom finds out, right? You're likely going to get in a little bit less trouble. Still going to have some, punishment, timeouts to, in this case, probably going to owe some fees, but not having to pay a lot of fines and penalties on top. So before I get into each one, I'm not going to ask, who's done each one of these and kind of get into, everybody's skeletons in the closet or dirty laundry, but using the hand raise, raise your hand if, let's say, you are familiar with any one of these. I'm not going to say, have experience. Great. That is a good chunk. All right, so you're all pros. I think sometimes these can get a bit of a bad rap on specifically prior disclosures, which we'll get to. But sometimes, the thought is, oh, I don't want to tell them. We can just fly under the radar. It's best to go to customs and correct these any errors that you find and not roll those dice. So we'll jump into each one in a little bit more detail. The post-summary correction. It's a correction of entry summary data through ACE. The entry must be in accepted status. Can't be under CBP review. Must be in CBP control. Entry summary has to be paid in order for the PSC to be submitted. This really, it allows importers to amend any entry summaries prior to liquidation. So it must be filed within 300 days of the date of entry and up to 15 days of the scheduled liquidation date. Do want to note this does only applies to formal entries, so your informal de minimis is not relevant. Another important note is that the PSC transaction contains all the same original data elements, so it's a complete replacement of your entry or any prior PSC. So you file an entry, file a PSC, you're completely replacing that original one. File another PSC on the same entry, you're replacing that first PSC. So this isn't we found a country of origin, let's just update that one record. You're updating everything that entry encompasses. An important note is that the PSCs, they address data elements that could have been determined at the time of entry. So if you're filing a lot of these, you're basically waving a red flag that, hey, we may not be exercising reasonable care. So while this is a mechanism for you to make updates, it's not something that you should just default to, oh, let's just get this entry filed, we'll file a PSC later. Because the more of those you're doing, the more customs is saying, well, why do they have to keep going back and correcting stuff that they should already know? An example of some of those things you can be correcting are let's see, non-revenue changes, essentially anything that is related to the revenue. So fees, duties, that would be HTS classification, potentially country of origin, value of your merchandise, right? Those are kind of the three big ones that'll impact fees or revenue to CBP. You can also amend some non-revenue data elements. So your quantity of merchandise, your description of the merchandise, quota visa number, Census Bureau data. You could even, in one case, you can change the entry type, right? So you can change an entry type from an 01 consumption entry to an 03 80 CBD and vice versa. Those are the only two. You can go back and forth. So if you got an 06 FTZ entry, can't then make it an 01. There are some elements that you cannot change via a PSC. be an importer of record. You could, however, file a customs form or CF 3347 to change the importer of record, and then that new entity or importer could file a PSC. The port of entry, the date of entry, any periodic monthly statement or kind of live entry indicator, as well as any USMCA indicator or preferential trade program. So those are a lot of things you can do. Let's say the entry is liquidated. Well, then you got to look at another mechanism. One that's often looked at is a prior disclosure. So if you're familiar with them, I'm sure prior disclosure, the words just make your skin crawl. They can be pretty hefty in a process, but they are your legal protection from Section 1592 penalties. So for negligence, gross negligence, fraud. Essentially, you're disclosing the circumstances of a violation to CBP before or without knowledge of the commencement of a formal investigation of that violation by CBP. Basically, it says, hey, Mom, I broke the vase. It is important to note that formal investigation begins on the date recorded in writing by customs, as the date, facts, and circumstances were discovered or received, which caused customs to believe a possibility of a violation exists. And it is the burden of proof is on the person asserting lack of knowledge. So if you're saying, oh, I didn't know that, why not? This allows for the payment of the loss of revenue without substantial penalty. Common examples are under or overvaluation, misclassification, evasion of AD/CVD, improper country of origin, which declarations or marking. I'll tell you a fun, I'll put in air quotes, story from when I was in-house. A company that I used to work for acquired another company. They were a national distribution company. They acquired another company for one of the big reasons was that new company had an IOR number. So they needed a trade team. Me and two other people were hired on to essentially start it. As we were going through again, I'll air quotes, procedures or manual, realized there was a lot of information that wasn't quite there. Reviewing some of the entry data and realized there was misclassification. So we thought, okay, likely going to be a prior disclosure. Maybe we can do a PSC. All right, this is part of the steps in evaluating is, is the prior disclosure really the right avenue? Right. We advised upper management basically saying, hey, something's going to have to happen. We're still trying to figure out what that is. We didn't go to outside counsel, but you could. One thing we did do is look to make sure we had a comprehensive review so that if we're disclosing something, we're disclosing it in its entirety and not just focusing on that classification issue. So this actually kind of saved us because we said, oh, this is a wrong classification. Let's keep looking at any other issues. Well, that classification, if it was correct, would have been subject to a bunch of AD/CVD orders. So had we just filed, hey, we misclassified this, CBP is well within the right to say, yeah, you did, but you also didn't have any AD/CVD. So we had to pay a good amount of duties and interest, but saved us from a substantial amount of fines and penalties since we basically had to go back 5 years to identify all of the problem areas. So when you are disclosing something, how do you do that? You can find the legal requirements, 19 CFR 162.74 and 163.11. But really it boils down to identify the issue or issues you're going to disclose, calculate and tender duties, fees, taxes, and interest, identify corrective actions and process improvements to ensure future compliance. This one's huge. It could be training, operational processes, implementation of an audit program. And a big key is the final disclosure must be in writing. So if you are, let's say, on a call or in a customs swings by and you're talking to them, if you make an oral disclosure, you need to document that and make sure that there's documentation sent to CBP within 10 days of that oral disclosure. If you're interested in kind of digging in a little bit more on the procedures and how this works, CBP in November of 2021 did release an internal directive. That number is 5350-020A. You won't find it on CBP's website because it is internal, but if you Google it, probably second or third link down, it's out there. It's internal. It does walk through the process from time of receipt by CBP of the disclosure, processing payments, handling extensions, etc. So again, this is some of those, how do you stay ready? Just kind of keeping a pulse on what's going on in the trade community, any changes, and make sure you're covered. The last one on here is a protest. So protest contests CBP's decision related to imported merchandise, generally filed on a CBP form or CF-19, although it doesn't have to be. And so CBP has 2 years to provide a response on filed protests, unless the protest relates to exclusions of merchandise. This would be filed within 180 days of liquidation. I said CF-19 could be filed in writing or submitted electronically in ACE. What it must set forth is each CBP decision being protested, each category of merchandise affected by CBP's decision, and the specific objection made in the protest and reasons. So what can be protested? You can find this 19 CFR 174.11, but since you're here, I'll just tell you so you don't have to go look it up. Clerical errors, mistakes of facts, and other inadvertencies. CBP administrative decisions involving the appraised value of merchandise, classification and corresponding duty rates and amounts, any charges, including interest, within the jurisdiction of the Secretaries of Homeland Security or Treasury, exclusion of entered merchandise from entry, delivery, or demand for redelivery to CBP custody, liquidation, reliquidation, or any modification of an entry, CBP refusals to pay drawback claims, refusal to reliquidate any entry made before December 18th, 2004, and CBP refusal to reliquidate any entry under Section 520D of the Tariff Act of 1930. A lot of things, right? But I think of the big takeaways from this section is do review, periodically check and make sure that what you're saying you're doing it, right? If that's really and you know what you're doing. But if you're doing those things, the chance of there being substantial issues is greatly diminished. Whether it's, hey, we've always got our buyers classify things, or they're always kind of getting us into trouble with how they're sourcing. Well, work with them, talk to them, and kind of build those procedures around what are the trade implications that, if not communicated, could get you in hot water. And if you find an issue, do a full comprehensive review and understand what's the best approach, right? Prior disclosures are, not necessarily your first go-to, right? If you can fix something via PSC, go ahead and do that. But make sure you fix it in its entirety and it's not something you're constantly updating, or it's a systemic issue, right, that is going to raise that flag more than you would want. If you want to go to the next slide. Best practices. So we just kind of talked through a good chunk of these. I'm not going to read all of them, but I will skim to see if I didn't miss any. The last one I think is pretty important, is providing an easy to follow narrative for any transaction reviews. So, if you've gone through any, especially, let's say digging up an entry from a year ago, you don't know exactly what that shipment was. You found an issue, digging through emails, trying to cobble, it's like detective work, right? Trying to cobble together what happened here. I have this email thread, I have this document, we got a new document that updated, yada yada. Well, then trying to explain that to someone can be a bit of a challenge, right? So anything you can do to make it clear and kind of focus customs attention on what you want them to look at, right? So the next slide is an example of, you're providing documentation, highlight the relevant field they're looking for, right? Or the relevant line. You can do that on invoices as well to kind of show and trace what the issue was, where it came from. Even if you have email correspondence, highlighting just those areas that you want them looking at, so you don't just dump a bunch of kind of word salad and documents and have them really fine-tooth comb digging through everything that you may not want them to. Whether or not it is, let's say everything else is fine, that's just more time that they're spending, right? So if you can direct their attention and make it clear as to what's the issue, how are you addressing it going forward, that's going to expedite the process and make your communication with customs a whole lot smoother. I know we're getting close to time, but the last thing I want to cover are a couple programs that might help get you off the list, right? The first being CTPAT. So if you can raise your hand in the chat if you're familiar. Let's say if you're a member of CTPAT. Do we have any on here? A couple, but I don't know if their hands just remained up the entire time. If so, they must be tired. CTPAT is a great program. It's voluntary. It's a partnership program with Customs. It aims to ensure strong internal compliance programs, protect the supply chain against security gaps. There are, some benefits to it. If you have a foreign trade zone, that's actually a CTPAT best practice. So it's probably a low lift to apply and become a CTPAT member, largely due to increased security requirements. But some of the benefits are, I want to go to the next slide. I think a couple that are relevant just from this webinar alone. If you're a member of the CTPAT Trade Compliance program, which is kind of an evolution of the old ISA importer self-assessment framework, one of the big benefits is you get removal from the focused assessment audit pool, right? So the understanding is you've gone through all of this process and built the procedures around securing your trade flows and having the appropriate documentation. We're not going to throw you in that assessment audit pool. So that alone will get you out of this. There is a grace period of 30 days where you can file a prior disclosure, even if CBP has already become aware of an error. That's pretty huge if you're looking at some hefty fines or penalties, right? You got a 30-day buffer to say, oh, here's the disclosure, we've done our due diligence and have our corrective action. There are a couple other benefits here. One is claims subject of forced labor in their supply chain, such as front of line admissibility review, redelivery holds, and the ability to move detained shipments to bonded facilities. So we were talking a lot about forced labor and the implications and kind of increased focus as of late. CTPAT is a good program that can help provide some flexibility if you find yourself kind of in that bucket or being looked at in that way. With that, any questions?
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah, please, if anybody has any questions for Matt, Courtney, or Allison, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your questions. Maybe raise your hand first or something just so we can have it orderly. Also, feel free to put those questions in the chat.
And if you don't have any questions now, we'll be sending out the deck, and you're more than welcome to reach out to any one of us.
Absolutely. Okay, no questions. Okay, well, Allison, Courtney, Matt, is there anything else you would like to add before we close today?
Sure. We will share these slides with everyone, as Matt mentioned. I just wanted to call out that we do have some resources listed at the back. These are basically just some more information that we already spoke to. But if you just want to, dive a little deeper into any of the topics, we have some resources here. We also included, sorry for the fast review. We also have just a few slides on the forced labor issue, just what it is. We're not going to cover them today, but we will provide those to you with the slides as well.
Perfect. All right, well, if there's no questions, then I would like to truly thank Allison and Courtney and Matt from FTI Consulting for giving this presentation today, talking to us about what to expect from a customs audit and how to be prepared and all that goes along with that. So thank you very much for all of your presentations today. It's very helpful. And again, we will provide those to the MITA members on the call. If you are not a member, I'll encourage you again to go to mitatrade.org and join MITA, and then we will be sure and get you these presentations for your library of resources. Please do not forget about our October in-person event at the Fluno Center in Madison. That is Tuesday, October 10th. We would love to see all of your faces, since we didn't really get to see your faces today on the camera. We'd love to meet you all in person and network and expand our networks and learn more about who you are and your role in international business. So please register at www.mitatrade.org, and we look forward to seeing you and meeting you in person next month. I think that is it. Enjoy the rest of your day and your week. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you.